Hello, everybody. Today I chat with Jan Voelkel, who is part of a Stanford kind of polarization lab. And they just did this amazing strengthening democracy challenge that showed a bunch of these interventions, like these like do-gooder Heineken ads and stuff like that, that can actually decrease polarization by a substantial amount. It's gone up, 20 points in the last 40 years, and this ad kind of decreased it by 10 points. Within a small period of time, and then it has like some diminishing returns there, where it's like you get a little bit less polarized, but then like as you get back into the normal media environment, you get repolarized again. But it's just a really good interview, and it shows, I think, a lot of hope for the kind of memetic engineering that we can do as a society. And I think it also shows, just a way to do these beautiful mega studies. This was a massive mega study. It was a huge team at Stanford and a bunch of other places. They had 250 submissions. They ran 25 of those submissions. So they crowdsourced the submissions, and then they crowdsourced the advisor team for which submissions actually succeeded. And then they also ran it on 32,000 people. And so it's just like a massive mega study, and I hope to see more both memetic engineering and what can actually nudge us towards less polarized, more positive realities, and also more of these mega studies to be run. So I hope you enjoy this episode with Jan, who talks about how to decrease polarization and how to run mega studies. Thanks. Hello, Rhys's Pieces. I'm Rhys, the co-founder of Root, and welcome to The Rhys Show. The century is a turning point in human history, and I'm here to help you navigate it. I hope you come away with a new understanding of the scientific, technological, and societal trends that are poised to radically reshape our world, and how you can work with those trends to become a live player in building a solar punk future. And today, I'm excited to chat with Jan Voelkel. Jan is a Ph.D. student in sociology at Stanford University and was one of the leading authors of this amazing Strengthening Democracy Challenge, which is this mega study identifying successful interventions to strengthen Americans' democratic attitudes. Jan, thanks for being on the show, and welcome.
Thanks so much for having me. Very excited to talk to you about it.
Yeah, I'm excited to dive in. And it was funny, Jan and I were chatting about beforehand. I was trying to get his name right, the German. So I got Jan. Jan is easy, but then Voelkel, like the V there is hard for me. Can you say it again back for us, me and our listeners?
Sure. Yeah. I would say Voelkel, but
Voelkel. It's just kind of like an F. Voelkel.
Yes, right. Like an F. That's right.
Yeah, beautiful. And as a note for our listeners, I mean, this Strengthening Democracy Challenge. Yeah, so the goal for you and I and our listeners to understand today is like, what essentially that we've been given this internet that is this kind of reality where there's lots of outrage and polarization, and that's kind of natural based off of the attention economy, and it's natural based off of the like little homes in our brains that like are triggered by emotions in these different ways. But that's not actually what we actually have to have for the long-term future of humanity. We can kind of do some memetic engineering or whatever you might want to call it so that we can make a better social media ecosystem for everybody. And what Jan's work, as Jan and this massive crew of folks, they did, it kind of points at a possibility for us to kind of nudge ourselves into the information that codes us to make that information in that media like more positive. And so maybe, Jan, just for our listeners, could you tell us about, the overall like setup of the Strengthening Democracy Challenge and some of the like learnings that you achieved from it?
Yeah. So basically, to start, I am part of a lab at Stanford where we are always interested in testing out ideas on like how to change people's attitudes. Like, we're like very interested in like the predictors of political attitudes, of moral values. So like when there's a lot of recent events happening in the US and around the world, we like identified that that some of the issues with regard to anti-democratic actions rising in the nation, that this was such an urgent issue that we wanted to do it a bit differently than we usually do. And so like, instead of doing our own, little study by study approach, what we wanted to do is a so-called mega study that involves an element of crowdsourcing. So like instead of just like a few people in our in our lab trying to think about like how to address this. We wanted to bring in everyone from like across the social sciences, from like outside of academia, outside of the ivory tower, like activists, practitioners who are working on this on the field, trying to really leverage the best ideas that are out there, but they can also be transformed into scalable interventions. Like interventions that are cheap, that a lot of people can be exposed to, don't take a lot of time, don't take a lot of effort. So we put out an open call. We had no idea how many responses we would get. In the end, we received like 252 ideas for strategies, how to reduce anti-democratic attitudes, support for political violence, partisan animosity. And we were super thrilled about having received so many ideas. However, our funding only allowed us to test 25. So suddenly we had a different problem than how to get from 252 down to 25. And for that, we had a great advisory board of experts in the field who helped us to identify what we conceived of as the most promising strategies. And then we tested 25 strategies all at the same time in a huge experiment with 32,000 participants, American partisans, who were exposed. Each of them was exposed to a single strategy or like what we call a control condition. So like a group that we would use for the purpose of comparing the people in the
just like sending them something that's not even it's not like a text or a video. You're just like, hey, just do this thing that we don't actually think will have an impact.
Exactly. Yeah.
Wasting their time. No, yeah.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And so like that enabled us then to say, like these 25 interventions have these effects on what we perceive to be like important measures of public opinion in the US. And also because they were all tested with the same sample, with the same kind of measures in the same time frame, we were able to say not only which one has an effect, but also which one has the strongest effect. So which one is the most promising strategy to potentially apply in the field.
Yeah. I love that. I think that's a great, so I think, and there's a lot of things that we could dive into, but one part is the idea of a mega study. And I just think that is, as the world gets more kind of Twitter native, network native, where it's like, look, we shouldn't just be doing, back in the day, it's like, okay, you had Freud and you had his like assistant and like they would run a study and they'd learn out that, oh yeah, we have penis envy or, it's like, that was like 200 years ago. Today, it's like, okay, there's everybody on the interwebs. And so you can crowdsource it and you can say, great, let's get these 250 submissions. Let's also crowdsource the advisory board. Let's get an awesome list of panelists and experts. And then let's start to run these things. And the other part of the scale, as you said, is 32,000 people, where it's like, great, let's have these 32,000 people. And the interventions themselves are also scalable. And so for our listeners, as a side note, like these interventions, they're things like, there's like the two classic ones that people may have already seen are there's a Heineken ad where they these two folks, it's like people come into the same they come into like a room and one of them is like an anti-trans person, the other one's kind of like a trans woman, and then they're just like, yo, and but then they start to like do some stuff together, like they like build a couch and stuff like that, and then they later realize they show videos of them speaking about like anti-transness or whatever, and they're like, oh man. But then what they do is they say, hey, you can either choose to leave or you can have a beer with the other person. They're like, yeah, let's have a beer. And then the people totally get each other. It's not like, the anti-trans person's not like a deep anti. He's just like, I don't know, it's a little bit scary for me. And then the trans woman over there is like, it's cool. Like, this is who I am. And so they just kind of, and there's that video. There's this Utah one where it's like right and left just saying, hey, no matter what happens, we're going to like, solidify this election. And then some of the ones are text. I went through a couple of them and like tested them out for myself, where it's like, they're just these text videos that just show you these like perception gaps essentially between the left and the right, where you're like, oh, I'm more lefty or whatever. So I'm like, oh man, the right people are the worst. They're like, they probably think 90% of them don't want anybody to like come into the United States. And actually they totally don't believe that. That's like an extremified version of things. So it's kind of, there's video versions and there's text versions. Do you want to tell us more about the kinds of I want to dive in on the study for a second, then we can get to mega studies and like other long-term stuff later. The study, what did we? I mean, we learned that's what are some of the key patterns of the key interventions that actually like worked for people?
Yeah. So one of the like overarching points here is that like you have to be very careful in this space to not put all of the like to not see all of these like different attitudes as being the same thing. Like we like we like weren't sure, like what what is the most important thing to intervene on. So we offered submitters three choices for attitudes that they could target, and like and the main result from our study is that people in our field, like researchers, but also practitioners, know very well how to treat partisan animosity. Like 23 out of 25 interventions in our study had an effect significantly reducing partisan animosity, which you can think of as like dislike for supporters of the other party. The most successful strategies there were to highlight relatable, likable, exemplar supporters of the other side. And you just like talked about the intervention that had actually won the whole competition for partisan animosity. The video that showed that people from like different sides can be relatable, can have pleasant interactions with each other that are respectful.
And let me pause you for a second actually on that, which is that is crazy, by the way, that we have this video. It's just like a 4-minute beer ad, from Heineken. And that of all these, you got these researchers who are these like, PhD tryhards or whatever. It's like, wait a second, let's just show this like ad that was like a good kind of good loving ad. And and it just, to me, that shows me it's both interesting that it's just an ad, but it also shows me the scalability of it, which is like, man, that ad should have been played across the whole world. So I don't know. We can come back to that in a second. But so in any case, so part of it's I heard you say is that the partisan animosity is for you kind of just show that the other side is like a reasonable, kind of possibly likable person.
Right.
But
yeah. And then the other like big strategy that was very successful was to highlight a shared identity between Republicans and Democrats. Like one identity that is like very common is like a joint national identity, like that like Democrats and Republicans all care about the well-being of America. That was like the third best performing interventions for partisan animosity. And then the second one argued that Republicans and Democrats together actually constitute an exhausted majority who are like often fed information that is trying to make them more polarized, but actually they have a lot in common in that they want to get along with each other, and they don't want to be so polarized. So these were the two main strategies that stuck out for partisan animosity. For the other outcomes, the most successful interventions were quite different. Should I dive into that, or do you want to?
Yeah, that's great because and an interesting piece, and for the folks, there's this great Twitter thread on all this. But like, there's an image on it which is like, and I think you wrote a Twitter thread on this too. It's like you come in thinking, okay, partisan animosity is going to be the main thing, but then actually this like support for undemocratic practices, when you look at like the causal, like the coefficients of like how like the correlations between them, they're not actually that connected somehow or something. Yeah. So tell us about what, if not partisan animosity, but for like support for undemocratic practices or maybe support for partisan violence, what kinds of things work there and how are those different? Because in my mind, I'm like, oh, if you're a partisan, then you might just like support violence or something. But tell me more about that.
Yeah. And I think like this is like an assumption that we in the lab have actually held for like quite some time, that like partisan animosity would have all of these important downstream consequences for democracy. And it took us like two years of like pre-testing and like setting up the challenge to be like, like maybe we shouldn't assume that, and also really like enable people to just target outcomes like support for undemocratic practices directly. Like, first of all, maybe for for the listeners, what do we understand as support for undemocratic practices? Well, like, you could think of like someone intentionally reducing the number of polling stations in areas that typically vote for the other side, or saying that uh, if one loses the next election, one shouldn't accept the results of that election. So
Or like gerrymandering or something like that. Yeah.
exactly, yeah, like doing something that goes against democratic principles, that helps your own party.
Yeah.
Like that was what we're trying to get here. And it's like, people don't love it, but like people tolerate it sometimes, especially when it helps to make sure that your own party wins. And and we found that like two or three strategies that are promising there are: one, this was the most successful one, is like correct inaccurate perceptions about supporters of the other party. Like, so Democrats and Republicans both strongly overestimate to what extent people from the other side support undemocratic practices, and that then may create a feeling of, well, if they do it, we may not really want to do it, but we kind of have to in order to level the playing field. So when you present participants with real information about to what extent supporters from the other side actually support undemocratic practices, that also reduces their own levels of support for undemocratic practices. The other very successful strategy was to highlight the disastrous consequences of a democratic collapse. Like when you sacrifice democratic principles for potential electoral gain, you're playing with fire. And if that goes wrong, there are actually really bad consequences. And that has happened in other countries, and may have been pretty closer to that happening in the US as well.
Can you give it, what's a specific example of like that happening in other, like, I guess you're just thinking about like, oh, in Venezuela or something, or in Russia, that's like Putin is just like, I'm going to be the next person,
Right. Yeah. Like exactly. Like there were like pictures that were shown from like Venezuela, from Turkey, from Russia, where like certain democratic liberties that people have held were taken away. And so it was a video that tried to induce fear and a realization of like what is at stake when one sacrifices these democratic principles, and like that also reduced support for undemocratic practices. And then the third strategy is elites coming out and endorsing nonviolent democratic engagement. You have already talked about the Utah video, like two gubernatorial candidates in the 2020 election in Utah coming out a few days before the election, promoting a joint ad where both of them say, hey, we're going to accept the results of the election independent of who's going to win it. And that also helped increasing support helped reducing support for undemocratic practices by that has been shown across many different domains, that elites have a lot of power in swaying the attitudes of the mass public. And just as with the stereotypes, like elite cues can obviously also go the other way, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So
I was about to say, yeah. So it's funny because like you have the people being like, we're both going to agree that the election wasn't a fraud, and
right.
and then everybody's like, okay, cool, the election's not a fraud, and then vice versa. It's like, hey, somebody, aka Donald Trump, if if Trump's like, look, this was a fraud election, this was rigged, then everybody's like, yeah, I guess it was probably rigged then. And so yeah, it's just like the power of that. It's interesting because I think, yeah, it's like, so that one, it's like, the elites have power. There's kind of the the show the downside where it's like, look, fear. You're like, look, don't be a, there's a slippery slope here. And then the kind of bringing a knife to a gunfight thing where it's like, oh, if the other side's doing it, I'm going to do it. So it's like, like game got to respect game. And so, but if you're like, oh, actually, they don't want to do this either. So how do you, So I guess a question that I have about this, and so it sounds like you're able to, if we have this reality where people have less partisan animosity because they see the other side is likable, they see that we're shared Americans, and then they also are not supporting these, they're supporting democracy, they're not supporting undemocratic practices because they're like, look, the other side doesn't support it, the elites don't support it, and if we do it, it's bad. Then how is, well, I guess there's a lot of ways to go from here. The first question I might have is, why is partisan animosity not connected to undemocratic practices?
Yeah, that is a great question, and I think the field is like at a point where we're trying to figure that out. Like there's been quite some debate, like to what extent partisan animosity is connected to this larger group of anti democratic attitudes. And like one thing that we find like very consistently is that partisan animosity has no relationship with support for violence at all. Like although you may think that like dislike is sort of a precondition for supporting violence, and like there were like a few potential explanations. One is that support for violence isn't so much rooted in like dislike for the other side, but maybe it's like rooted in like more general personality traits, like such as, for example, an like inclination for aggression, or it is that like this dislike alone doesn't really capture it, but you have to measure a more extreme version of that. For example, there is some evidence that there might be a relationship between dehumanization and violence. Also, like that is like still being investigated, but it seems like in order to get to violence, like you may have to go more extreme than dislike. When it comes to more like specifically undemocratic practices, like we actually found some evidence that when you really intervene on partisan animosity strongly, like the interventions in our studies with the strongest effect reduces by like roughly 10 points on a 0 to 100 scale.
Okay.
You may or may not think that is a lot, but that is roughly half of the increase in partisan animosity that has happened over the last 4 decades. Like there's actually quite, or like there, like when you reduce partisan animosity by that much, you see some effects on intention to vote for a candidate who endorses these undemocratic practices. So like it seems like the path might be there. It's relatively weak, so you really have to like increase partisan animosity by quite a bit. But when it comes to voting, at least it could be that it makes a difference, that you become more open for even considering the other side when you think that your own candidate really isn't that great of a candidate. Yeah, but like, yeah.
I was gonna say, yeah, I mean, that's a really interesting. I think there's like a, trying to understand all these like causal things are so interesting. I think that's where we're going as societies, both with just statistics, with artificial intelligence, and all this like this like deeper understanding of like what nudges us in which ways, in which parts of ourselves genetically and memetically like make us do different things. It also, that's interesting to note. Yeah, it's gone up by 20 points, but then you're saying it's gone down by 10 points by showing someone a Heineken ad. Is that like, but does that have actually a long-term effect on them, or is like I see the Heineken ad and like over the last 4 decades I've been getting more and more partisan. I see one Heineken ad and now half of that's gone. Like, is that true, or like how long lasting is the lack of partisan animosity?
Yeah, like I mean, to be sure, like I don't think that like seeing the Heineken ad will like depolarize you forever. Like we did a durability test in the study where we followed up with participants 2 weeks later, and we see that the effects, like roughly like 40% of the original effect is still there. So like so you could like think of that as like instead of reducing partisan animosity by 10 points, it may now rather be like by like 4 points or so, which is like so like if you like spin that further, right, like at some point the original effect might be gone. So it's like I don't think that we should take away from the study like you just have to do this one time, problem solved. Maybe if you do it twice, we basically have made up for the last 40
Yeah.
years. But rather like this like tells us that there is a causal effect of like seeing relatable supporters from the other side. And if you, as you have said at the beginning in your introduction, if we can change the media environment so that people were actually exposed to these phenomena or to like these impressions more often, that could then have a more durable effect. And obviously we'd also have to see whether like that would hold in a study that is like designed for like repeated exposure. So like a lot of open questions there, but I do think that like it is promising to explore that based on our findings.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think and it's I mean it makes sense. It's like yes, it's like we've gotten 20 points more partisan animosity in the last 4 decades. You've reduced 10 of it if you do it quickly in a after watching the Heineken ad, and then 2 weeks later that person is like, okay, like I still kind of see a little bit of relatability, but I'm mostly just being pilled by Fox News or CNBC or sorry MSNBC or whoever, and then they are. And then, yeah, as you said, it might kind of decrease more. But then all this stuff is just a question of, where it's like, I mean, it's just like from like a Bayesian, like priors about the world thing. It's just like, it makes total sense that we've gotten so much more polarized based off of like what we see, what the other side is doing and what the quote unquote the media is feeding us. And that if you have a different version of media that is kind of feeding you, don't forget, like, in addition to bonding capital with your own tribe, there's also bridging capital with the other side. Like, don't forget, like that exists, and the other side is kind of reasonable, blah blah. Then that could actually have a long term effect. So, how do you see this? Is this going to be how will this actually change like the platforms themselves? They've been kind of like the way I think about it is like the platforms have been focused. First, it's just like, great, we're going to post whatever we want because that's how we get around like copyright laws and blah blah blah. And then it was like, oh man, there's all these harms, and so they had to spin up all these massive teams, both artificial intelligence and human, to like turn all the knobs to make sure that the harms were not happening as much. And they did a really good job where it's like the terrorist groups on Twitter or whatever, they get taken down within like the first 24 hours almost all the time. However, so we've like decreased the quote unquote disinformation by adding friction in various ways, but we haven't necessarily like added back in these more positive elements or something. And so, how do you think about how some of the learnings from Strengthening Democracy Challenge might be actually implemented into social media platforms?
Yeah, I think that I think there were several actors who could use our results to like drive them to impact. And I think social media organizations are certainly one of them by promoting content more that like corrects inaccurate stereotypes and those like what people see in their news feeds. Like it could also like make a decision to if elites put out certain statements, like promote those more strongly, especially like when they are bipartisan, right? I mean, like, it's like always tricky for organizations to like do something that is not bipartisan, but like if we can find enough candidates who would be willing to put out such a statement, that could be promoted very very heavily on social media. I mean, the Heineken ad video went pretty viral a few years ago. So I do think that there is a lot of potential. In general, I think our results give you a toolbox and like handbook to see, like what do I want to intervene on, like what are some principles that I could try to apply. So if you are a like practitioner, who's like trying to like put together your own app, like what are the overarching themes that I want to achieve? Well, if you can like correct inaccurate stereotypes about out partisans with your content, that is like probably a pretty promising strategy. And also like we have a bunch of findings that like tell you like what not to do, because they have backfiring effects, because like sometimes like even like brilliant ideas can actually like turn out like badly in the real world. Like that's a drama of a PhD in the social sciences, that oftentimes your ideas like don't work out and you don't know what to do with that. So like for example, the video that I was talking about earlier, highlighting the disastrous consequences of democratic collapse, also included a part about the attack on the Capitol from January 6th, and we found that among it like reduced support for undemocratic practices more strongly among our Democratic participants than among our Republican participants. Still caused a reduction for Republican participants as well, but actually had a backfiring effect on Republican participants for support for violence. So it increased support for violence among Republican participants. We can't really say why. Our best guess is sort of like that it like legitimized violence. Like we're like showing that content. So to try to be aware of like what kind of principles could have surprising effects is another thing that I think would be is very important to consider when one is trying to drive these results to impact.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think one for me, it's just like the thing to stay away from is to not ever touch anybody's confirmation bias or their own identity and things, where it's just like, it's like, okay, you already believe and you're like, da da da. We're not hating on you right now. All that we're doing is just talking about how the other side might be actually reasonable, or how you actually share something with the other side, or how the elite. So it's like doing that feels more okay than being like pointing at the person, being like you can kind of like point at the other person. So is there a like let me ask like a different. I know you're kind of you're both you're a PhD student, so you're kind of new to this world, and just also for our listeners, for context here, it's like, yeah, Jan was a crucial like when you think about, and I don't know all the work. I mean, this was years of work with tons of logistics, where you're just like getting in tons of different people and like making sure that it went well. So thank you for doing that, and that's amazing. And Jan, is there but like pushing out of maybe even using your PhD background, but also like doing a little bit of experimental kind of dreaming. If you were to like design a feed, let's say there's this new feed out there called face Twitter, or Google Book or something, like what does that, if you wanted to actually make it more generative and towards kind of like positive things, like what would be your optimal version of what that feed would look like?
Yeah, yeah, that's a great question. Like dreaming about like what would happen if you would one of another member of our team had this idea of like writing something about like if I could run Facebook for one day, like what would I do? Yeah, so like I think like what I would try to like design is like that people just see the full picture, so like if there's like if like content gets added for a new issue, instead of like seeing some like well written emotional post about that, it might be more valuable to actually like show like a diagram of like what's the like distribution of responses from from people, just to give you a bit more context about like what does really the entire group think about a certain event, instead of just like making that generalization from like a, a few tweets or so. And then the other thing, that is like, I think that like, this is like not so much social media, but if I was a powerful donor, like to political campaigns, like I would like make campaign contributions conditional on a few basic principles. I would I would love to like I would love to see my candidates like do a video like the two candidates in Utah did. And if we like if campaign contributors could like nudge their candidates like promoting such content, I think that would be worth a lot.
I love both of those. Seem really smart. Where it's like, look, you just have a well, so the distribution one I think is great. I mean, in the whole world, for me, this world of like prediction markets and Metaculus and things like that that look at distributions of those those are like percentage chances that things are going to happen in the future. Those are really helpful to say, like, instead of being like, at the beginning of COVID, January, February, March 2020, it was like, go looking at those places was really helpful, because it was like, instead of saying, oh, COVID's not a big deal, or COVID is going to be a massive deal, you get to look at the distribution, and so looking at the distribution is really helpful. I think similarly for people, where instead of just being like, oh, here goes this other Democratic lefty kind of crazy social justice warrior, and here's this righty MAGA Trumper, blah blah blah, who's just doing their thing again. And instead, you're like, oh, wait a second. Whenever that little thing shows up, you get to see a little thing next to it that says, as a reminder, this is being optimized for you, because that's the way the feed optimizes things, that it wants to look at the other side. But actually, if you look at the graph, most of the people are just living a normal life, being normal, like reasonable people. So that seems great. And I love the distribution idea, and the distribution gets at the perception gap. It gets at in a lot of the interventions that you guys had these like distributions where you just get to look at both sides and see how they actually like align on stuff. Then the other one is interesting, the YouTube one, or the kind of doing a campaign ad where it's like, yeah, wow, what an amazing, that would be just it's like, hey, look, you at least have to be like, and it requires people to think in terms of one America and one country and stuff. But like, look, just to like be with the person on the other side, to treat them as a reasonable person, to do something with them that where you're like coming at, versus obviously, I'm just reminded of Marjorie Taylor Greene, who is like a kind of a crazy woman on the right. She Biden had this kind of antagonistic speech earlier today, and then she tweeted a thing that like she gave him like a little Hitler mustache and like put the stuff in the background and made it like Nazi symbols and stuff. And like, that's obviously the opposite of like what it means to like look at the other side and be like, we actually both support each other, or whatever. So interesting. Okay, so I kind of get a vibe there. Do you think? Well, and let me ask another question here, which is, when you think fundamentally about quote unquote what's gone wrong and what we need for it to go right, I think that like your distribution idea is good and the kind of money idea is good, but from like a what's gone wrong idea, and I think like deeply systemically like root problems here, it's like, why are we in this hyperpolarized place with a very unresponsive government in various ways, in a kind of gridlocked vetocracy, and how would we kind of escape from that?
Yeah. Like, I think like we have, I mean, we only address like one angle on this whole problem, right? Which is like we focus on public opinion, how to change attitudes, and the way from attitudes to actually seeing changes in the real world is like still like a pretty far one. Like, I would say that like the path to like voting for undemocratic candidates, like that's the like number one path for like that, like almost anyone who's eligible to vote can take, right? Like, really prioritize democratic principles. Like when you're thinking about like for which candidate should I vote, like in terms of like what did us lead here? Like, I think like one prominent theory is that like um or like a trend that we saw was that like elite polarization happened before polarization in the mass public. So like while it used to be the case that there was quite a bit of overlap between the two parties. They were like liberal Republicans, conservative Democrats. Like the two parties have like very much polarized over time, which makes it harder to make the switch over to the other side, and then like creates this whole, and then combined with the primary races allows like way more extreme candidates to make it into to Congress, asking more difficult questions to partisans, right? Like if it is if you have to make the choice between either like undemocratic candidate from your own party or like someone from the other side whom you really don't like that may not be an easy choice for like a lot of people. There's also evidence that our that that the partisan identity has become way more important over the last few decades, in the sense that it has become more connected to other important identities uh, in our lives. Like the Democratic Party may send now more for like certain gender groups, or like certain ethnic groups, and for certain religious groups, and like all of those identities being tied together also like makes it way harder to really consider the other side as a choice, and that and that gives elites a lot of power. um
Yeah, those are both interesting. I think that there's like, this question, as you say, it's like, okay, just purely, I'm kind of a maximalist on like information codes humans, and then humans go out and do things. And so it's like, oh, if we just change the attitudes, we change reality. But actually, there's more to it. And as you say, I think that both those things about why polarization exists is pretty interesting, because I think we're kind of used to the narrative of, oh, social media polarized everybody. But in fact, it's like, no, there was elite polarization first, and then the rest of it was kind of downstream. And so it's like, oh, if we're able to kind of somehow make elites less polarized, which gets to all their kind of incentives for like the kinds of roles that they can play, so making less polarized elites, and then also the like just the identity kind of collapsing, where it's just like there's quote unquote flyover states with left behind Republicans, and then there's like coastal elites, and it's like that's kind of, and all the demographics, they all just kind of line up with each other now. And so that's like, there's a huge correlation, so that the identities kind of get baked in a sad way. Yeah. So let me ask maybe two other questions here, and then to wrap. Well, so one is, so what's happening, and I think, and I like the way I want to ask this is like, I know you are you're in sociology, and so tell me what's happening like sociologically when we think about like what's going on in people's minds and confirmation bias and blah blah, like what's actually happening behind the scenes that's making people polarized, and then that's also kind of decreasing their partisan animosity. Are there like kind of frameworks that we can use to understand, like from a sociology perspective, what's happening there?
hmm. um yeah, that is a that is an that's an interesting question. Like, I think like if I put my sociology hat on, like it's like the problem like is like sociologists perceive problems as like s- structural problems more than individual level problems, right? So common things to like think about then would be like a uh, like the way that the political system is structured in the US, with two parties, so you only have the choice between two poles, then you can win an election without winning the popular vote. So you actually sufficient to play to a certain base that doesn't even need to be the majority. And true reforms are so difficult because there are so many hurdles that you would need to pass in order to also just like give all of the people who may not support undemocratic candidates access to the ballot box, and make sure that everyone votes, right? So yeah, but I'm yeah
I,
yeah.
I think it's an interesting way, yeah, because like sociologically, it's like it's an interest. It's like, I think psychologically, it's like what's happening in the brains of the individuals, and then sociologically, it's like, okay, how are the groups of individuals working here, and how are they kind of using groups to bind and blind them away from other people? How are they using? How is the kind of the structure, the kind of institutional governance structure? How is that like leading to this? So that makes some sense in terms of like thinking in terms of group dynamics. Is like the frame to put on. Let me ask one other question here, which is there a so for designing meta studies? I mean, so you did this amazing thing of designing these meta studies. If there are any, for the listeners out there who are, in academia and who are thinking about, instead of just running their own little thing, it's like just instead of running your own study, how to kind of crowdsource with the crowd to do this, to run an actual meta study or mega study, sorry. Do you have any recommendations for folks who might be wanting to run a mega study for what they should do?
Yeah, a lot. Yeah, so first of all, I want to say that I think it's really exciting to be able to work on a mega study, because I think you can work on a project that goes beyond the scale that one can typically work on in grad school. Like the most important thing, I think, is to pick a problem that one cares about, and one knows one will also care about in a few years, and that like like it is a good target, in the sense that you think that it's worth for a lot of people to spend time on trying to influence that target, or try to explain that target, right? So for example, for us, we first talked of partisan animosity. Then after we had found in some of our pretests that partisan animosity isn't that related to anti-democratic attitudes, or might be, at least this link isn't as strong as we had previously thought. We were like, hey, is it really worth it to do all of this big tournament just on partisan animosity? And so we decided to switch to include some other targets as well. And then another big lesson is that you can only do these studies as a team. That goes by itself with regard to the crowdsourcing aspect. And I think it's important to design the project in a way that other people find and get ownership on the project as well. That starts with authorship guidelines, for example, if you're in the nerd space of academia, but also make sure that the environment that you're creating for this mega study is something that resonates with other people too, because in the end you're very dependent on them providing their ideas and trusting you with their ideas. So you also want to create an environment that is meaningful for them, and then team up with a bunch of people on the logistics, so that you don't have to do it all yourself. And there, I want to say a big shout out to my co-leaders of the project, Nick Stagnaro and James Chu, who I think always had this great mindset about the project, in terms of we are here to make this work, and like that sometimes means that we have to like put ourselves back at the team first in order to make this project happen. And yeah, we had like 3 great PIs on the project, and Jamie Druckmann from political science, Dave Rand, who's at the MIT Sloan School of Management, and Bob Wheeler was the main person behind the project in sociology at Stanford. So like the 3 of them all having their big visions for the project, and also like bringing in different networks of people who could contribute with their different field backgrounds. That was really helpful. And then like all of the staff in the lab, Sophia Pink, Joe Mernick, Crystal Wedekop, who have like done a lot of the on the ground work with Nick, James, and I, where like a lot of late night emergency calls, and like cleaning things up, and like testing stuff for the like 100th time. So yeah, like there's a lot of work and infrastructure to be needed. But it feels great that like when one really like puts all of these components together, I think that like we can help to move a field forward in a different way than like than a single study or even a single research program can.
Yeah, no, I love that. Exactly. It's like you can either do a little study and it might have an impact, or you can do a mega study, which is going to take more time, more people, more effort, but it plays out. It's also funny, yeah, because it sounded like you kind of turned into an award speech. You're like, I'd like to thank Nick and James, my great in the trenches. I'd like to thank the PIs. Well, and it's great though, because everybody had a huge part of this massive study, and so finding ways to get ownership, authorship, all those things are crucial. But the final little round here is I'd love to ask, and by the way, if anybody, you should do mega studies. If and if you want to hit up Jan to ask how he did his, ask him. I want to ask 2 quick overrated, underrated. So I'm going to say a thing, and then you're going to tell me in 15 or 30 seconds, you're going to say whether it's overrated or underrated, and then a quick bit on why. And so the first one is, do you think the impact of the internet versus the impact of media, traditional media, is the impact of the internet overrated or underrated compared to traditional media?
Oof. Based on the research that I know, like I would say like maybe overrated, like not so much that the impact is actually overestimated, but I think people sometimes underestimate the impact that traditional media still has.
Yep, great. Yep, agree with that. And then what about what about using social media platforms as the actual like theory of change, the lever for change and changing kind of like our information ecosystem? Do you think that's overrated or underrated?
Like I think yeah, it's tricky. I would say that it might be, yeah, it's tricky. I would say underrated, and explain what I mean. Like I think that like I think that like it might not be the best way to intervene, because one just like doesn't have a lot of power over what to do. Like our team has zero power over like whether Facebook or Twitter is going to use our findings. And like the number of people who are going to make that decision is very small. So I don't think that it's very, very democratic or like great for like societies to live in that space. But like I think that if we can shift like part of the conversation to like how we can work within these organizations in order to like make things like gradually better. I do think that that is a take that deserves a lot of attention.
Yeah, great, love it. Well, thank you again, Jan, for coming on the show, and for doing the Strengthening Democracy Challenge. If listeners want to learn about it, you can just go to strengtheningdemocracychallenge.org. You can look at the coolest thing that you can look at is you can actually do these interventions, and you can be like, oh wow, this is the one that had this impact. This is the one that had this impact. So that's like really fun and interesting. And also, if you want to check out Jan on Twitter, he is YG Voelkel, which I can now say better. JG, sorry, JG, not YG. JG and then VOELKEL. Jan, is there anything else you'd like to tell our listeners today?
No, thanks so much for having me. I had a lot of fun talking to you about this.
Yeah, me too. It was great. Well, thank you again, Jan, and thank you, listeners, for listening. Goodbye, everybody. Thanks so much for listening today. If you liked the show, please give us a 5-star podcast review or subscribe on YouTube. And if you'd like to chat about this episode with a community of amazing, smart, ambitious, divergent people, come on by and join our Discord. You can find it at root.co. That's ROOTE.co. And then finally, if you'd like to contribute to these ideas being shared more widely in society, you can support the podcast production team at patreon.com/Rhys Lindmark. That's patreon.com/RHYSLINDMARK. Thanks, and see you here for the next episode. Bye.